Hi, I am Rachit Saxena from Pramati Technologies. This video is about the configuration of Hystrix library in microservices architecture. So in this video, we will see Hystrix configured for microservices. When we run a microservices component with the Hystrix library, what advantages we get, and when we run it without Hystrix, what are the problems that we face. So basically this video is about the configuration of Hystrix library in microservices deployment. Hystrix is basically an open source library from Netflix that helps application to recover from latency and fault tolerance. So in this video, we will cover two use cases. First one, a microservices component working without Hystrix, and we will try to replicate a failure scenario and observe the impact of remote call failures. Second, the same component will be refactored to use Hystrix library. Again, in this use case as well, we will replicate a remote API call failure scenario, and then we will see how Hystrix comes to rescue from these failures as compared to the first use case where we did not use Hystrix. Another interesting stuff to observe here will be impact on other API calls from the same microservices. For example, if a microservices component exposes 5 APIs and one out of these 5 APIs is failing, what happens to remaining 4 APIs? Will they perform well, or they will get impacted because of this? When one of the API calls starts failing from one microservices component, this should not impact other APIs from the same microservices component. We will also see the impact of this in both the scenarios. Okay, so for showing a demo, we will use two of the microservices component. First one is user domain and another one is user service. Both of these are microservices based on microservices, and user domain exposes a set of APIs. Those are used by user service. So basically user service makes remote call to user domain to get its data. If we see what all remote calls exist for user domain in user domain, so these are the set of remote API calls. So we will be taking for our example, we will be taking a get provider by ID and get provider by GUID. So if we see here, like it's not doing anything special, it's just getting a plain client to make the remote call and then calling the actual service method. And let's see how this is used in user service. So this class, if we see, is resides in user service repository, and if we go to get provider, there's a call user domain client dot get provider. So this configuration is not wrapped in any kind of Hystrix configuration here. It's just a plain call. So if this call takes 10 seconds or if this call takes 20 seconds because of any issue, then this call will wait for 20 seconds here. So let's see this running in our okay, so in get provider API, what I have done, I have intentionally introduced a delay, and then I am throwing an exception from here to replicate a problematic API. So in real use case, what will happen, some network issues or some error because of data, or some error will occur that will cause this kind of scenario. But here to show the demo, like I have added this delay of 7 seconds, and then after that I'm intentionally throwing an exception from here. So let's call this API and see how the results looks like. So here what I have done, I have started JMeter, and I have fired few requests from JMeter to get this provider by ID, and we can see here like the response coming for all the API calls is consistent. It's close to 40 seconds. If we see starting from the first call, if we see, like, it's sometimes it's going 56 seconds, sometimes it's going 57, and like it depends, 56 seconds. So APIs are not failing fast. For each API call, it's taking close to a minute of time. So this is really bad, because my API call, in all the cases, even if I know my API is not responding, every call is taking 1 minute of time. So this is the use case without Hystrix configuration. Now let's see how we have configured Hystrix in second scenario. Okay, before going to that, let's see how the other API responds, how much time it takes. So this is the API I execute, and this is another API that returns me a provider based on GUID, and I got the data. But if we see here how much time it took 26 seconds to load, 20 close to 27 seconds. So this API is also impacted, because all the threads here are consumed by this get provider by ID. So other APIs are not getting chance to execute, and that's why other APIs also started taking more time. So this is what we call, like, the APIs are if one API is failing, it's causing cascading failure, and other APIs are also getting impacted because of this. Now we will see the second use case where we have Hystrix configured in user service. So when user service invokes endpoint from user domain, it will it will wrap the remote call into a Hystrix command, and then it will call the remote API, and then Hystrix will decide, okay, based on the failure rate, based on the success rate. So we have, if we see here, we have threshold value defined, when how many threads should be configured, what is the threshold value, and what is the time when Hystrix should try out whether the API is up, whether the API has recovered from a fault or not. And if if Hystrix knows that, okay, the circuit, the call is failing, for all the successive all the calls coming for that remote API call, it will open the circuit. So it will not wait for 1 minute as we saw in the previous use case. It will instantly return the value configured for that particular API. So first API that we saw was provider by ID. So on the consumer side, that's our user service. We have defined a provider by ID API, and here we are extending from a class based Hystrix command, and here we are wrapping the actual call. If we remember, we saw this call was directly made in the previous example, but here we are wrapping it in a Hystrix command. And we are saying call using circuit breaker and passing the proxy object to it. So if we see this implementation, so what we are doing here, we are calling it creating a new circuit breaker command, passing all the Hystrix configured properties that we configured in this configuration file, and then we are saying, okay, make the call, and in case of failure, just return a default fallback result, so that the Hystrix will know, okay, this particular API is failing, I should not make the call until unless this API has recovered from a fault. So let's see this example in action. My Tomcat started with Hystrix configuration, and let's go and change the port to 8082 and start. Okay, so now what I have done, I have started my Tomcat. It's running on port 8082, and I have changed port here to 8082, and I'm starting all the threads to make call to a faulty service. Let's see the results here. So if you see here, like, all the calls are taking 13 milliseconds. all the new call. See, we got it in 8 milliseconds. If we see the response data from here, saying it's clearly saying circuit breaker has been tripped, due to which fault was reached without hitting run. Okay, so the time taken by the API, the faulty API, which is in trouble, which is throwing exception from user domain, get provided by ID, is taking 6 milliseconds, which took close to 1 minute when we did not use Hystrix. But now it's taking only 6 milliseconds or 5 milliseconds. It's within 10 milliseconds of time we are getting a response. So let's go and check. The response, what response we are getting. In the response, it's clearly saying the circuit has tripped. Circuit breaker has been tripped, due to which fallback was reached without hitting the run. So it's not even going to the actual API call, because Hystrix knows the remote API call is not performing well. It should not make a call until and unless it is recovered from that failure scenario. And let's see what is the impact on the other call. So in the previous example, it took close to 28 seconds to respond. Let's see in this case how much time it takes. So in this case, if we see, it just took 740 milliseconds. So it's not causing the cascading failure. The other APIs are not getting impacted because one of the call is failing from that API. So we can see the Hystrix is working here. And okay. Okay, now what we'll do, we will try to we will fix the user domain get provider API, and we will see the circuit is getting closed, and all the APIs those were failing earlier will now respond properly, and we will see Hystrix will do all the checks whether the API is up again or not. Based on that, it will decide whether to make the API call or not to make the API call. So in this case, what I'm doing, I'm going to just fix the problem. I will just toggle the flag, and we will see the response of this API get provided by API, and we saw that Hystrix recovered from the failures, and now the API is responding. And similar thing is for the provider by GUID also. This API is working as before. So these are the advantages that we get when we use Hystrix. So we don't need to bother about, like, when we as a consumer of any remote API call makes a remote call. So we don't need to bother like how much time it's taking. API don't need to wait until and unless it gets timeout or it gets a exception or error from the remote API call. The circuit breaker will take care of it. It will know that when to make the remote call and when not to make the remote call, and it will also keep on polling the remote API call that is failing to check whether the API is up or not. So these are the advantages we get. We recover from the failing API's fault whenever there is a fault in a remote call. It don't wait for a long time. It just responds very fast. So this is really helpful. Thank you.